The security camera caught everything: a mistress pushing a pregnant wife down courthouse stairs, a brother catching her mid-fall, and a smile that went viral with 47 million views. But what the video didn't show was the insurance fraud history, the fake social media accounts, or the conspiracy to steal $8 million from an unborn baby. This is the true story of Isabel Crawford, who survived attempted murder and exposed two criminals who thought they were untouchable. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling us where you are from, and subscribe so you never miss stories of justice actually winning. This one will leave you speechless. Let's dive in. The courthouse security camera captured everything. Frame 1 showed a pregnant woman in white, hand on her belly, turning toward the stairs. Frame 2 revealed a woman in crimson red, arm extended, fingers pushing. Frame 3 captured the fall. Frame 4 showed a man in a dark suit catching her midair. Her brother, a federal prosecutor who had just walked in to surprise her. Frame 5 froze on the mistress's face. Not horror, but a smile. This footage would break the internet within 2 hours, rack up 47 million views in 24, and destroy 3 lives while saving one. But before justice came chaos, before viral fame came violence, and before the truth emerged, a woman had to survive being pushed toward death by the woman who stole her husband. Drop a comment telling us what time you started watching and where you are tuning in from, because this story is about to take you on a ride you will not forget. Isabel Crawford stood in her modest Georgetown apartment as dawn light filtered through cheap curtains. At 28 years old and 7 months pregnant, she moved slowly through the small one-bedroom space she now called home. 6 months ago, she had lived in a sprawling Potomac estate with her husband Dylan. Now she packed legal documents into a worn messenger bag, preparing for what she hoped would be the final divorce hearing. Her best friend Nora Campbell arrived with coffee, letting herself in with the spare key. Nora worked as a domestic violence advocate and had seen too many women in Isabel's position. She helped Isabel zip up a simple white maternity dress. "You sure you do not want me there?" Nora asked, setting down the cups. Isabel shook her head. "I need to do this alone. Besides, you have got the fundraiser today." She touched her rounded belly where the baby kicked. "Just you and me today, baby girl. We are getting free." The television played in the background, a morning news anchor discussing local business news. Developer Dylan Crawford's Riverside Plaza project faces federal investigation amid allegations of financial irregularities. Isabel's hands trembled slightly as she packed custody documents. Her phone buzzed with a text from her brother Marshall. "Flying in early? Surprise witness for your case. Trust me." She allowed herself a small smile. Marshall Crawford, federal prosecutor and her older brother by 4 years, had been her rock through this nightmare. When she discovered Dylan's affair 8 months ago, Marshall had flown in from New York immediately. He had helped her find this apartment, loaned her money when Dylan froze their joint accounts, and promised her that justice would prevail. The affair had started, as far as Isabel knew, about a year ago. She had found the texts on Dylan's phone while he showered, messages to someone named Scarlett. "She is leaving for her mother's this weekend. Come over." Isabel had been the she. The mother she was visiting had just been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. Confronting Dylan had been useless. He had denied everything at first, then admitted to a brief fling, then finally confessed it was serious. He wanted a divorce. He wanted to marry Scarlett Vance, a 26-year-old former fitness influencer who had somehow captured his attention completely. What hurt worse than the betrayal was how Dylan had turned cruel. He claimed Isabel had trapped him with the pregnancy. He accused her of being controlling and manipulative. He told their friends she was unstable. And worst of all, he had embezzled $3.2 million from the nonprofit Isabel had founded to help domestic violence survivors, using the money to fund his lavish lifestyle with Scarlett. Isabel had resigned from her own organization in shame when the embezzlement was discovered. The board had been sympathetic, knowing Dylan had sole access to the accounts, but the damage was done. Her career, her reputation, everything she had built was gone. "You ready?" Nora asked gently. Isabel nodded, slinging the bag over her shoulder. "As ready as I will ever be." They took an Uber to the courthouse. Isabel could not afford her old car, another casualty of Dylan's financial warfare. As they pulled up to the imposing federal building in downtown Washington, D.C., Isabel saw the press gathered on the steps. Dylan's business scandal had made him notorious. Reporters crowded the entrance, cameras ready. "Mrs. Crawford," one shouted as Isabel climbed out of the car. "Is it true your husband embezzled from your nonprofit?" Isabel froze. She had not known the story was public. Nora grabbed her arm and pulled her forward. Inside, the courthouse was all marble floors and echoing footsteps. The metal detectors beeped as they passed through security. Isabel's lawyer, an overworked public defender named Richard Sullivan, waited by the courtroom doors. "Mrs. Crawford," he said, his face grim, "I need to warn you. Dylan's team filed an emergency motion this morning." Isabel's stomach dropped. "What kind of motion?" "They are claiming you are mentally unstable due to pregnancy hormones. They cited your resignation from the nonprofit as evidence of erratic behavior. Judge Holbrook is considering ordering a psychological evaluation before making any custody decisions." The words hit Isabel like a punch. "That is insane, though. He embezzled from my organization. I had to resign because of what he did." Richard Sullivan nodded sympathetically. "I know, but Graham Foster is one of the best defense attorneys in D.C. He knows how to muddy the waters." That was when Isabel saw them. Dylan Crawford stood near the courtroom entrance in a $5,000 suit, looking every inch the successful developer he pretended to be. Next to him, draped on his arm like expensive jewelry, was Scarlett Vance. Scarlett wore a crimson-red Valentino dress that probably cost more than Isabel's monthly rent. Her long, dark hair fell in perfect waves. Her makeup was flawless. She looked like she had stepped out of a fashion magazine, not a courthouse. As Isabel approached, Scarlett's lips curved into a smirk. Her voice carried across the marble hallway, loud enough for everyone to hear. "God, that dress makes her look like a whale. No wonder he came to me." Dylan did not defend Isabel. He smirked. Isabel felt her cheeks burn. She kept walking, head high, one hand protectively on her belly. The baby kicked as if sensing her mother's distress. Richard Sullivan touched her elbow. "Ignore them. Let's focus on the hearing." But as they entered the courtroom, Isabel could not shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. She had spent months hoping this day would bring closure. Instead, the nightmare was getting worse. The preliminary hearing lasted only 20 minutes. Judge Patricia Holbrook, a stern woman in her late 50s, reviewed Dylan's emergency motion with a frown. She asked Richard Sullivan for Isabel's response. He argued that the motion was a transparent attempt to harass his client, that Isabel had been cooperative throughout the divorce proceedings, and that there was no evidence of mental instability. Graham Foster, Dylan's attorney, stood and delivered a polished rebuttal. "Your Honor, Mrs. Crawford resigned from her position under suspicious circumstances. She has made wild accusations against my client without proof. She is clearly under extreme stress, and given her condition, we believe a professional evaluation is warranted to ensure the child's safety." Isabel wanted to scream. The suspicious circumstances were Dylan's embezzlement. The wild accusations were documented facts. But Graham Foster had a gift for making lies sound reasonable. Judge Holbrook removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes. "Mr. Sullivan, I am inclined to grant the motion. However, I will give you 72 hours to provide documentation of Mrs. Crawford's mental health treatment, if any exists, to establish that she is receiving appropriate care during her pregnancy. We will reconvene Friday morning." It was not the worst outcome, but it was not a victory either. As the judge's gavel fell, Isabel felt her hope crack. This was supposed to be the end. Instead, it was just another delay, another humiliation, another chance for Dylan to twist the narrative. Outside the courtroom, Isabel excused herself to the restroom. She needed a moment alone, away from the lawyers and the cameras and Dylan's smirking face. The courthouse bathroom was quiet, mercifully empty. She leaned against the sink and took deep breaths, trying to calm her racing heart. When she emerged, she found her path blocked. Dylan and Scarlett stood in the corridor near the grand marble staircase that led down to the main floor. Scarlett held her phone up, clearly filming an Instagram story. "Justice Day. Babes," Scarlett chirped to the camera. "Sometimes you have to fight for your happiness." She added a heart emoji gesture and ended the recording. Isabel tried to walk past them, heading toward the stairs where Richard Sullivan waited below. But Scarlett stepped directly into her path. "You know what I love about Dylan," Scarlett said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "He is a real man, not like whatever you turned him into." Isabel kept her eyes straight ahead. "Excuse me." Dylan grabbed her arm, his grip tight. You are going to drop the custody fight. You are going to take $50,000 and disappear. Isabel jerked her arm free. That baby is yours. She deserves better than this. Scarlett laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. That baby, honey. We both know you trapped him. How convenient you got pregnant right when he was about to leave you. Something inside Isabel snapped. For months she had stayed quiet, trying to take the high road, trying to be reasonable, but standing there 7 months pregnant, being mocked by the woman who had destroyed her marriage, she could not stay silent anymore. I got pregnant on our 5th anniversary trip, Isabel said, her voice shaking but clear. You texted him the next week. I saw the metadata on the photos you sent. They were taken in our house while I was at my mother's funeral. The words hung in the air. A few people in the corridor had stopped, sensing drama. Phones came out. Scarlett's face twisted with rage. You are a liar. You are crazy. Isabel turned away, done with the conversation. She took a step toward the staircase. Her back was to this woman. She did not see Scarlett move. The push came hard and sudden. 2 hands against Isabel's back, right between her shoulder blades. With her center of gravity already thrown off by pregnancy, Isabel had no chance to balance. Her feet stumbled forward. The marble floor seemed to tilt. Papers exploded from her messenger bag, flying into the air like white birds. Her hand reached desperately for the railing, but found only empty air. She was falling backward, her body tilting toward the cruel marble stairs. People screamed. Someone shouted, "Stop her!" But it was too late. Isabel saw the ceiling spin. She felt weightless. Time seemed to slow down. All she could think was, please, not my baby. Please. Then a hand caught her wrist. A strong grip, vice tight, yanking her back from the edge. An arm wrapped around her back, taking her weight. She gasped, her vision blurred with tears and shock. Easy, a familiar voice said. I have got you. Marshal Crawford had appeared from nowhere, having just entered through the courthouse's side entrance. He had seen everything. His prosecutor's suit was wrinkled from travel, his tie loose, but his grip was steady as steel. He pulled Isabel upright, away from the stairs, and lowered her gently to the marble floor. The baby, Isabel whispered. Marshal, the baby. The crowd gathered quickly. Security guards rushed over. An officer began shouting into his radio. We need paramedics on the 2nd floor. Now. Marshal held his sister, his face dark with fury as he looked up at Dylan and Scarlett. Both stood frozen at the top of the stairs. Scarlett had gone pale. Dylan's mouth hung open. What did you just do? Marshall's voice was quiet, but it cut through the chaos like a blade. Scarlett recovered first. She slipped, I did not. She came at me. She was threatening me. But too many people had seen. Too many phones had been recording. Officer Brennan, a young cop with a body camera clipped to his uniform, had been standing nearby and captured everything. Marshall looked up at the security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. Its red recording light blinked steadily. Do not let anyone touch those recordings, Marshall said to Officer Brennan, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority as a federal prosecutor. No one. I want every angle secured immediately. Yes, sir, Officer Brennan replied. Isabel closed her eyes, trying to breathe through the pain lancing through her abdomen. The baby was moving, kicking frantically. That was good. That meant she was alive. But something felt wrong. The pain was intensifying. Paramedics arrived with a stretcher. Dr. Catherine Pierce, an emergency physician, knelt beside Isabel and began a quick assessment. She pressed a stethoscope to Isabel's belly, listening intently. Heartbeat is strong, Dr. Pierce said, but you are having contractions. We need to get you to the hospital now. Marshall climbed into the ambulance with his sister. As the doors closed, he saw through the window as Detective Morrison began reading as Scarlett her rights. Dylan stood beside his mistress, his face a mask of shock and growing horror. The ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing, carrying Isabel toward an uncertain future. George Washington University Hospital's emergency room was a blur of white coats and urgent voices. Isabel was rushed into an examination room where Dr. Robert Matthews, the on-call obstetrician, performed an ultrasound. Marshall stood in the corner, his phone buzzing incessantly with calls he ignored. The ultrasound machine beeped softly. Dr. Matthews moved the wand across Isabel's belly, his eyes fixed on the screen. The silence stretched. Isabel could barely breathe. "Is she okay?" Isabel whispered. "Please tell me she is okay." Matthews smiled. "Finally. The baby's heartbeat is strong. Contractions have stopped. You are both going to be okay." The relief hit Isabel like a wave. She collapsed back against the pillow, sobbing. Marshall moved to her side and squeezed her hand. "You are safe now," he said quietly. "Both of you." But even as Isabel was moved to a recovery room, Marshall's mind was already working. He stepped into the hallway and made a call to Detective Morrison. "Morrison, it is Marshall Crawford. My sister is stable. What have you got?" Detective Morrison's voice came through the line, professional but excited. "Marshall, this is the most documented assault I have ever investigated. Officer Brennan's body camera caught everything. We have got 6 different cell phone videos from witnesses. The courthouse security system has 4 angles in high definition. There is no ambiguity here. Scarlett Vance pushed your sister down those stairs." "What about Dylan?" Marshall asked. "He was present. He physically grabbed Mrs. Crawford's arm moments before the assault. We are looking at possible conspiracy, witness intimidation, maybe extortion given his statement about the $50,000. Marshall allowed himself a grim smile. "Arrest. Scarlett is already in custody. We are bringing Dylan in for questioning now. Graham Foster is having a fit, threatening lawsuits. But the evidence is airtight." After the call ended, Marshall returned to Isabel's room. She was sitting up now, sipping water. Nora had arrived and sat beside the bed, holding Isabel's free hand. "What happens now?" Isabel asked. Marshall pulled a chair close. "Scarlett was arrested. Dylan is being questioned. The district attorney's office is reviewing charges. With the evidence we have, Scarlett is looking at aggravated assault on a pregnant woman, which is a serious felony. 5 to 10 years minimum." Isabel nodded slowly. "And Dylan Baum? That depends on what they find. But Belle," Marshall used his childhood nickname for her. "With this evidence, his custody case is dead. No judge in the country will grant custody to a man whose mistress tried to kill the mother of his child." For the first time in months, Isabel felt something like hope. She looked down at her belly where the baby was finally settling, kicks becoming less frantic. "Is it really over?" she asked. Marshall hesitated. He knew Graham Foster's reputation. The man did not give up easily. But looking at his sister's exhausted face, he could not bring himself to voice his doubts. "It is over," he lied. "You and the baby are safe now." Across town, in Graham Foster's luxury office on K Street, Dylan sat in a leather chair worth more than most people's monthly rent. His hands shook as he watched the video that had already gone viral. 8 million views in 3 hours. The comments were brutal. "This is attempted murder. Lock her up forever. That poor woman and her baby." Graham Foster, a silver-haired man in his late 50s with ice blue eyes, watched the video for the 10th time. He set down his tablet and looked at Dylan. $2 million retainer, Graham said. "Cash, wired to my account by end of business today. I can make this go away." Dylan looked up, desperate. "How the whole world saw it." Graham smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "The whole world saw a confrontation. They did not see what led to it. They did not see your wife's history. They did not see the full story." He pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. "Here is what we are going to do. First, we established that Isabel has been harassing Scarlett for months. Online stalking, threatening messages. We will create evidence if we have to. Second, we paint Scarlett as the victim defending herself from an aggressive, unstable pregnant woman. Third, we destroy Isabel's credibility. Her nonprofit collapsed under suspicious circumstances. She is under financial stress. We will find therapists who treated her for depression or anxiety, normal things, and make them sound sinister." Dylan swallowed hard. "What about the video? Videos can be taken out of context. We will argue Scarlett was reacting in self-defense, that Isabel came at her first, that the angle does not show everything. It is all about creating reasonable doubt." "And my federal investigation?" Dylan asked quietly. Graham's smile widened. "Win this case, control the narrative, and suddenly you are the victim of a vindictive ex-wife who is trying to destroy you because you fell in love with someone else. That buys us sympathy. Sympathy buys us time. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick file. Did you know your wife signed a post-nuptial agreement 3 years ago? Dylan frowned. What? No, we never. According to this document, filed with Maryland courts, Isabel agreed to waive all claims to your business assets in exchange for a $10 million payment upon divorce. She has not received that payment. That is fake, Dylan said immediately. I never signed that. Graham's expression did not change. Interesting, because the signature looks real. And if it is fake, who do you think made it a desperate woman who just accidentally got pushed? The implication hung in the air. Graham was going to claim Isabel forged documents to extort money, then stage the courthouse incident to gain sympathy and leverage. Dylan felt sick. This is insane. This is survival, Graham corrected. The question is, do you want to survive? Dylan thought about 20 years in prison for the embezzlement. He thought about losing everything he had built. He thought about Scarlett, who he had convinced himself he loved, spending decades behind bars. Wire the money, Dylan said quietly. Graham nodded and picked up his phone. Within hours, the counter-narrative would begin spreading across social media, in carefully placed news articles, in leaked court documents. The story would shift from attempted murder to complicated situation with unstable woman. The battle for truth had only just begun. Within 48 hours, the tide began to turn. Graham Foster's strategy unfolded with ruthless precision. Conservative news outlets started running stories questioning the rush to judgment. A popular podcast host with 2 million listeners dedicated an episode to trial by social media and used Isabel's case as an example. We have all seen the video, the host said. But do we know what happened before the cameras started rolling? This woman resigned from her own nonprofit amid financial scandals. Her husband left her for another woman. That is painful. No doubt, but does pregnancy give someone the right to harass and threaten the new partner? Isabel watched from her hospital bed, unable to look away. Nora had begged her to turn off the television, but Isabel felt compelled to witness her own character assassination. The breakthrough in Graham's strategy came when he produced the fabricated evidence. Screenshots appeared online showing Instagram accounts in Isabel's name, sending threatening messages to Scarlett over 3 months. You stole my life. You will regret this. I hope you suffer like I have. Detective Morrison brought the evidence to Marshall at the federal prosecutor's office in downtown D.C. The accounts were created using her email address, Morrison explained, his face troubled. We traced the IP address to her apartment building. Marshall studied the screenshots. This is fake. Belle does not even have Instagram. I believe you, but the technical evidence is there. Someone went to a lot of trouble to make this look real. Marshall had his tech team examine the accounts. Within hours, they found what they needed. The accounts had been created from an IP address that, while registered to Isabel's building, was specifically traced to the building's public Wi-Fi, not her apartment. The phone used to verify the accounts was a burner purchased at a convenience store in DuPont Circle. Pull security footage from that store, Marshall ordered. The footage showed Scarlett Vance buying the phone 2 weeks before the courthouse incident. She had been planning this for a long time, but before Marshall could present this evidence, Graham Foster filed his motion to dismiss all charges. He stood in Judge Holbrook's courtroom 3 days after the assault and presented his case with theatrical flair. Your Honor, this case is not what it seems. Mrs. Crawford has been waging a campaign of harassment against Miss Vance for months. He presented the fabricated Instagram messages. When confronted at the courthouse, Mrs. Crawford became aggressive. Miss Vance, in fear for her safety, put her hands up defensively. Mrs. Crawford, unbalanced due to her condition, lost her footing. Richard Sullivan objected. Your Honor, Ben, we have evidence these accounts are fabricated. Then presented at trial, and Graham shot back. But in the meantime, my client has been unjustly imprisoned based on a video that, while dramatic, does not tell the whole story. Judge Holbrook reviewed the motion carefully. Mr. Sullivan, I am going to allow the defense to present their evidence. However, I am not dismissing the charges at this time. Miss Vance will remain in custody, but I am reducing bail to $500,000. $500,000 was nothing to Dylan. Scarlett was released that afternoon. The worst blow came that evening. Marshall received a call from the D.C. Bar Association. Graham Foster had filed an ethics complaint against him. "You are the victim's brother," the Bar Association investigator said. "Your involvement in this case creates an appearance of impropriety. You need to recuse yourself from any prosecution related to this matter. And frankly, you should not be advising your sister on her civil case either." Marshall tried to argue, but the investigator was firm. By morning, Marshall was forced to step back. He could support Isabel personally, but professionally, he had to distance himself. When he told Isabel the news, she was in her hospital room, still on bed rest. The doctors wanted to monitor her for a full week to ensure no complications. "So I am alone again," Isabel said quietly. "You are not alone. I am still your brother, and I have asked the best prosecutor in D.C. to take over. Margaret Foster. No relation to Graham, and she is tougher than he is." But Isabel barely heard him. She was staring at her phone. An anonymous text had arrived with a photo of her apartment building. The message read, "We know where you live." Marshall saw her face go pale and took the phone. His jaw tightened. "I am getting you protection. Full time." That night, as Isabel tried to sleep, she felt the first real contraction. Not the false labor from the assault, but something deeper, more painful. She pressed the call button on. Nurses rushed in. Dr. Matthews arrived minutes later. His face was grave as he examined her. "You are going into premature labor. At 7 months, the baby has a good chance, but we need to stop this if we can." They tried medication. They tried bed rest at an elevated angle, but Isabel's body had made its decision. By midnight, she was in active labor. "I am scared," Isabel whispered as they wheeled her toward the delivery room. Marshall walked beside her, holding her hand. "You are the strongest person I know," Marshall said. "You survived him. You survived her. You will survive this." In the delivery room, surrounded by machines and medical staff, Isabel pushed her daughter into the world 2 months too early. The baby's cry was thin and weak. She weighed 3 pounds, 12 ounces. They whisked her immediately to the NICU. Dr. Matthews worked quickly, but there were complications. Isabel was hemorrhaging. "We need to do an emergency hysterectomy," he said to Marshall, who stood frozen outside the delivery room glass. The surgery took 3 hours. When Isabel woke, Marshall was there. "The baby?" she asked immediately. "She is in the NICU. She is breathing on her own. The doctors say she is a fighter." "And me," Marshall's face told her everything. "You are going to be okay." But they had to perform a hysterectomy. There was too much bleeding. They could not save your uterus. Isabel processed this information slowly. She would never have another child. At 28, that door was closed forever. But as she lay in the hospital bed, she realized she did not feel the devastation she thought she should. She had her daughter. She had her life. That was enough. "I want to name her Hope," Isabel said. Marshall smiled through his tears. "Hope Crawford. It is perfect." But their moment of peace was shattered when Detective Morrison arrived with more bad news. Judge Holbrook just issued a ruling. Because of the questions around the Instagram evidence in Graham Foster's self-defense argument, she is reducing the charges against Scarlett from attempted murder to simple assault. If convicted, she is looking at probation, maybe a year maximum. Isabel closed her eyes. "So she gets away with it." "Not if I can help it," Marshall said grimly. "Foster thinks he is one, but I have been investigating Dylan's finances, and what I found is going to blow this case wide open." While Isabel recovered in the hospital, Marshall worked around the clock from his federal office. He could not prosecute the assault case, but nothing prevented him from investigating Dylan's business dealings. And what he found confirmed his worst suspicions. Dylan Crawford's real estate empire was a house of cards built on embezzled funds and fraudulent loans. The Riverside Plaza development that made him famous had been financed partly with money stolen from Isabel's nonprofit. But it went deeper than that. Marshall's team traced financial records showing Scarlett Vance had been involved in Dylan's business for far longer than anyone claimed. She was not listed as an employee, but regular payments flowed to her personal accounts dating back 14 months, long before Dylan claimed the affair started. More damning, Scarlett's real name was not Scarlett Vance. She was born Sarah Vickers in Tampa, Florida. She had changed her name 3 years ago after being investigated for insurance fraud. She had staged a car accident, claimed severe whiplash, and sued for $200,000. The case was dropped when investigators discovered she had pulled the same scheme twice before under different names. Marshall brought this evidence to Margaret Foster, the prosecutor now handling the assault case. Margaret was a sharp woman in her early 50s with a reputation for destroying defense attorneys who underestimated her. "This changes everything," Margaret said, reviewing the files. "Scarlett is not a mistress who made a mistake. She is a professional con artist who targeted Dylan for his money. And those Instagram accounts, I bet we can prove she made them." Marshall's tech team had already done that. They traced the burner phone used to create the fake accounts to a purchase at a DuPont Circle convenience store. Security footage showed Scarlett buying it 6 weeks before the courthouse incident. She had been planning to frame Isabel for months. "We need to flip Dylan," Marshall said. "He is weak. He is terrified of prison. If we offer him a deal, he will give us everything." Margaret smiled. "Let me talk to Graham Foster first. I want to see his face when I show him what we have got." The meeting took place in a federal courthouse conference room. Graham Foster arrived with his usual confidence. His suit immaculate, his silver hair perfectly styled. He expected a plea negotiation for Scarlett. Instead, Margaret slid a thick folder across the table. "Before we talk about your client, you should see this." Graham opened the folder. His expression did not change, but Marshall, watching carefully, saw his jaw tighten. The folder contained everything: Scarlett's real identity, her history of fraud, the security footage of her buying the burner phone records showing calls between Scarlett and Dylan that predated their claimed relationship by 6 months, and finally, audio recordings. "What is this?" Graham asked quietly. "Your client's house is under federal surveillance as part of the investigation into Dylan Crawford's embezzlement," Margaret explained. "We have been listening to their conversations for 3 weeks. You might want to listen to last Tuesday's conversation." Margaret pressed play on a small recorder. Scarlett's voice filled the room, tinny but clear. "Dylan, you need to calm down, so the federal investigation is heating up. So we liquidate what we can, take the money, and disappear." Dylan's voice slurred from alcohol. "You said this would work. You said we would get rid of her, get her money, and nobody would know." "Shut up. You think I do not know this room could be bugged? Be careful what you say. You were supposed to scare her, not try to kill her." "Oh, please. You knew exactly what I was going to do. You positioned yourself where you could watch. You wanted me to push her. You just did not want to get your hands dirty." The recording continued. Scarlett talking about liquidating assets. Dylan talking about offshore accounts. And then the truly damning part. "If Belle dies, you get custody of the baby by default," Scarlett said. "The baby means access to her family trust fund, $8 million. Between that and what we can take from your company before the Fed sees it, we will have enough to disappear. Maybe Costa Rica. No extradition." Graham Foster's face had gone pale. He stopped the recording. "Where did you get this?" "Federal wiretap, authorized by a judge 3 weeks ago as part of the embezzlement investigation. All perfectly legal. Your client just confessed to conspiracy to commit assault, fraud, and oh yes, hoping the victim would die so they could steal from her infant daughter. How do you think that will play to a jury?" Graham was silent for a long moment. Then he closed the folder. "What do you want?" "Scarlett pleads guilty to aggravated assault and conspiracy to commit fraud. 20 years. No possibility of parole for 10. Dylan cooperates fully, returns all stolen funds, and pleads guilty to embezzlement and conspiracy. 15 years. My client will never accept that." Margaret shrugged. "Then we will see her at trial, and I will play this recording in open court. I will present evidence of her real identity, her history of fraud, her premeditation, and Dylan. He will spend the rest of his life in prison. Either while they are finished." Graham stood. "I need to talk to my client." "You have the 24 hours," Margaret said. After Graham left, Marshall turned to Margaret. "Do you think he will take it?" "I think Scarlett will refuse and Dylan will crack. Give it time." Marshall was right to be cautious. That night, Scarlett and Dylan fought in his Potomac mansion. The federal agents listening to the wiretap heard every word. "You are not taking this deal," Scarlett screamed. "We can beat this." "Beat what?" Dylan shouted back. They have recordings, they have video, they have everything. Then we run. We take what money we can access and we disappear tonight. I am not running. I am not spending my life looking over my shoulder. The fight escalated. Scarlett threw a glass that shattered against the wall. Dylan called her insane. She called him a coward. And then Scarlett made her fatal mistake. If you testify against me, I will tell them everything. The offshore accounts, the shell companies, the money you have been hiding from the IRS. You will die in prison, Dylan, and you will die there with me. Dylan replied coldly. The next morning, Dylan called Margaret Foster without Graham present. I want a deal. I will give you everything. 3 months later, Isabel sat in a federal courtroom holding her daughter. Hope was out of the NICU now. A healthy 4-month-old with her mother's dark eyes and surprising strength. She had gained weight steadily, and the doctors said she had no developmental delays from her premature birth. Isabel had moved to a new apartment with better security. Marshall had loaned her money, and the nonprofit board had voted to restore her position once the truth about Dylan's embezzlement became public. Donors who had pulled funding returned. Apologetic, the organization was rebuilding. But none of that mattered as much as this moment. Scarlett Vance, now revealed as Sarah Vickers, sat at the defense table in a plain gray suit. Her Instagram-perfect appearance was gone. No makeup, hair pulled back severely, an attempt to look sympathetic that failed miserably. Dylan had taken a plea deal, 15 years in federal prison in exchange for his full cooperation. He was testifying against Scarlett today. The trial had begun 2 weeks ago. Margaret Foster had methodically built her case. The body camera footage from Officer Brennan, the security camera videos, the cell phone footage from witnesses, the audio recording of Scarlett discussing Belle's potential death as beneficial. Graham Foster, defending Scarlett, had tried every angle. Self-defense, temporary insanity, claimed that Dylan had manipulated his client. Nothing worked. The evidence was overwhelming. Now, on day 10 of the trial, Dylan took the stand. He looked broken. Prison had aged him. The arrogant developer was gone, replaced by a man who understood too late what he had lost. Margaret Foster approached the witness stand. Mr. Crawford, how long have you known Scarlett Vance? Approximately 18 months, Dylan said quietly. And when did your relationship with her begin? About 14 months ago. While you were still married to Isabel Crawford. Yes. Margaret walked him through the timeline. The affair starting while Isabel cared for her dying mother, the embezzlement from the nonprofit to fund expensive gifts for Scarlett, the plan to divorce Isabel and take custody of the baby to access her family trust fund. Did you know Scarlett Vance was planning to assault your wife at the courthouse? Dylan hesitated. This was the question that would seal his fate or offer him a sliver of redemption. I knew she was angry. I knew she had been escalating. She talked about confronting Belle, scaring her into dropping the custody case. I told her not to, but I did not stop her either. When we saw Belle in the courthouse hallway, Scarlett said, "This is our chance." I should have walked away. I did not. Did you see her push Mrs. Crawford? Yes. And what did you do? Nothing. Dylan's voice broke. I did nothing. I watched my pregnant wife almost fall down a marble staircase, and I did nothing. The courtroom was silent. Margaret let that answer sit for a moment. Then she asked, Mr. Crawford, do you love your daughter? Dylan looked at Isabel, holding Hope in the gallery. The baby was sleeping peacefully. I do not deserve to, Dylan said. But yes, I wish I could have been the father she deserves. I wish I had been the husband Belle deserved. I destroyed everything, and I will spend the rest of my life regretting it. It was not enough. Nothing could be enough. But it was honest. Graham Foster's cross-examination tried to paint Dylan as a spurned lover manipulated by prosecutors. But Dylan would not play along. He admitted every terrible thing he had done. He confirmed Scarlett's premeditation. He sealed her fate. 3 days later, after closing arguments, the jury deliberated for just 4 hours. The four-person stood. We find the defendant, Scarlett Vance, guilty of attempted murder in the first degree, guilty of conspiracy to commit fraud, guilty of assault with intent to cause great bodily harm. Scarlett screamed. She had to be restrained by security as they led her from the courtroom. She shouted obscenities at Dylan, at Isabel, at the judge. The mask had completely fallen away. Judge Patricia Holbrook scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. On that day, Isabel gave her victim impact statement. She stood at the podium with hope in her arms and spoke directly to Scarlett. "You tried to take everything from me. My husband, my home, my career, my life. You tried to kill my daughter before she was even born, but you failed. I am still here. My daughter is healthy and loved. And you will spend the next 2 decades remembering the woman you could not break." Isabel turned to the judge. "I do not want revenge. I want justice. I want every woman who has been pushed, literally or figuratively, to know that the truth matters, that evidence matters, that justice is possible." Judge Holbrook nodded gravely. "Miss Vance, you demonstrated callous disregard for human life. You targeted a vulnerable pregnant woman. You showed no remorse. I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole for 15 years. Scarlett was dragged screaming from the courtroom. As Isabel left the courthouse, reporters swarmed. But this time she did not hide. She stood on the steps where she had nearly died and made a brief statement. "My name is Isabel Crawford. I am a survivor, and I am here to tell every woman watching that you are not alone. Your voice matters. Justice is possible." The video went viral, 40 million views. But this time, the comments were different, supportive, empowering, hopeful. Isabel Crawford had become a symbol of survival. 6 months after the trial, Isabel stood in a small office in downtown Washington, D.C. The sign on the door read, "Hope's House Support for Survivors of Domestic Violence." It was her new nonprofit, built from the ashes of the old one. This time, she controlled every account. This time, she knew exactly where every dollar went. Nora had joined as director of outreach. Together, they had helped 20 women escape abusive situations in just 3 months. They provided legal support, housing assistance, and counseling. The need was overwhelming, but so was the community response. Donations poured in from across the country. Volunteers lined up to help. Marshall visited the office on a Tuesday afternoon, bringing lunch. Hope, now 10 months old, sat in a high chair babbling happily while Isabel reviewed grant applications. "You look happy," Marshall observed. Isabel smiled. "I am. For the first time in years. I actually am." Her phone buzzed with a news alert. Federal court disbarment, Graham Foster stripped of law license. The article detailed how Foster had been found guilty of fabricating evidence, the fake postnuptial agreement. He faced his own criminal charges now. "Good," Isabel said simply. She felt no satisfaction, just a quiet sense that the scales had finally balanced. That evening, after closing the office, Isabel took Hope to the park near their apartment. It was early autumn, leaves turning gold and red. She pushed the stroller along the path, enjoying the cool air. A woman approached hesitantly. "Excuse me, are you Isabel Crawford?" Isabel tensed instinctively but nodded. "I just wanted to say thank you. I saw your trial on the news. I was in an abusive marriage, and seeing you fight back, seeing justice actually happen, it gave me the courage to leave. I have been free for 3 months now." Isabel felt tears prick her eyes. "I am so glad. Are you safe? Do you need help?" They talked for 20 minutes. Isabel gave the woman her card for Hope's House. They exchanged numbers. This was why the pain had been worth it. Not revenge, but the chance to help others escape. Across town, in a federal prison in West Virginia, Dylan sat in his cell. He had spent the past months in protective custody, separated from the general population because of his high-profile case. He used his time reading, thinking, and writing letters to his daughter that he knew would never be delivered. "Dear Hope," the latest letter began, "You will never read this. Your mother has made that clear, and she is right to. But I write anyway because I need you to know that my failures are not your fault. I was not the man I should have been. I hurt your mother in ways that can never be repaired. By the time you are old enough to ask about me, I hope you understand that sometimes people make choices that define them forever. I made mine. I live with them now. I hope you grow up strong like your mother. I hope you never know the kind of pain I caused. I hope you are loved, even if I cannot be part of that love. I hope it surrounds you always." He folded the letter and added it to the growing stack in his footlocker. The prison chaplain had suggested writing as therapy. It did not ease the guilt, but it gave structure to his days. In a women's federal prison in Pennsylvania, Scarlett sat alone in the recreation yard. Other inmates avoided her. They had seen the video, read the news stories. Even in a prison full of criminals, attempting to kill a pregnant woman made you an outcast. She had tried to maintain her Instagram persona at first, finding ways to smuggle selfies out, posting through friends on the outside, but the backlash was immediate and brutal. Her account was permanently banned. Her followers, once millions strong, abandoned her. The carefully constructed influencer life was gone. Now she spent her days working in the prison laundry and her nights planning appeals that her overworked public defender kept telling her would fail. The evidence was too strong, the jury verdict too clear. She would serve at minimum 15 years before even being eligible for parole. Some nights, she dreamed about that courthouse hallway. But in her dreams, Isabel did not survive the fall. In her dreams, Scarlett and Dylan got away with everything, living the life she had imagined. Then she would wake to the sound of prison doors clanging shut and remember the truth. She had gambled everything and lost. 1 year after the courthouse incident, Isabel was invited to speak at a domestic violence awareness conference in Baltimore. She had become a reluctant public figure, someone survivors looked to for hope. She gave speeches carefully, never enjoying the attention but understanding its importance. Marshall drove her to the conference. Hope, now 16 months old, stayed with Nora for the day. The little girl was walking now, babbling constantly, and showing a stubborn independence that made Isabel smile. The conference hall was packed. Isabel stood backstage, listening to her introduction. A woman who survived attempted murder, fought for justice, and now dedicates her life to helping others escape abuse. She walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. For a moment, she froze, overwhelmed. Then she saw a woman in the front row holding a sign. "You saved my life." Another woman held a baby, mouthing "thank you." Isabel took a breath and began to speak. 1 year ago today, I stood in a courthouse hallway believing my nightmare was ending. I was 7 months pregnant, exhausted from months of legal battles, ready to finally be free from a man who had systematically destroyed my life. She described the confrontation, the push, the fall, Marshall catching her. In that moment, falling toward those marble stairs, I thought about my daughter. I thought, please let her live. Even if I do not, please let her live. That was all I wanted, just for my baby to have a chance. The audience was completely silent. But we both lived. And in the years since, I have learned something important. Survival is not the end of the story. It is the beginning. Every day I wake up is a choice to keep fighting, to build something better, to help others find their way out of darkness. She talked about Hope's house, the women they had helped, the community that had formed. She talked about the importance of documentation, of believing survivors, of systemic change. Justice is not just about putting bad people in prison, Isabel said. It is about creating a world where fewer people become victims in the first place. It is about teaching our children, especially our daughters, that their voices matter, that they deserve respect, that abuse is never okay. When she finished, the standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. Women approached her afterward, some crying, all thanking her. She hugged them, exchanged numbers, directed them to resources. One woman, probably in her 50s, waited until the crowd thinned. My daughter was in an abusive marriage. She was too scared to leave. Then she saw your trial on TV. She called me crying, saying if you could survive what you survived, she could leave him. She got out 3 months ago. She is safe now, because of you. Isabel held the woman's hands. She did that. I just showed her it was possible. Your daughter saved herself. Driving home, Marshall asked, how do you do it? Talk about the worst day of your life over and over. Isabel watched the Maryland landscape pass by, because maybe someone hearing about my worst day will prevent it from becoming theirs. That night, after Hope was asleep, Isabel sat at her desk and opened her laptop. She had started writing a book, a memoir about domestic abuse, betrayal, and survival. Publishers were interested, but she was writing it for herself first, processing everything that had happened. She opened to the chapter about the trial and began typing. Dylan's testimony was the moment everything changed. Not because he suddenly became a good person, he did not, but because he finally told the truth, and the truth, ugly as it was, set me free. Not free from the memories or the trauma, but free from the doubt, free from wondering if somehow it had been my fault. His words confirmed what I always knew. I was not crazy. I was not unstable. I was not the villain in this story. I was just a woman who loved the wrong man and paid a terrible price for it. She wrote for 2 hours, the words flowing easier than they had in months. The book was becoming something powerful, something that ye might help others understand the psychology of abuse, the way it creeps in slowly, the way it rewrites reality until you question your own sanity. When she finally closed the laptop, she checked on Hope one more time. The little girl slept peacefully, clutching a stuffed elephant. Isabel stood in this doorway watching her daughter breathe, still marveling that they had both survived. "We made it, baby girl," she whispered. "We really made it." 18 months after the trial, on a cold January morning, Isabel received a letter. The return address was a federal prison in West Virginia, Dillon's prison. She almost threw it away unopened. Then curiosity got the better of her. She opened it carefully, half expecting some new manipulation. Instead, she found a single page, Dillon's handwriting, shaky but legible. "Belle, I do not expect you to read this. I do not expect forgiveness. I just need you to know that I understand now what I did to you. Prison gives you a lot of time to think. Too much time. I have replayed our entire relationship, seeing it now through clear eyes instead of the fog of selfishness I lived in for so long. I isolated you from friends. I controlled our finances. I gaslit you when you questioned me. I did everything an abuser does. And I told myself I was not an abuser because I never hit you, but I hurt you in worse ways. I destroyed your sense of self. I made you question your own reality. And when you finally stood up for yourself, I tried to destroy you completely. There is no excuse for any of it. I am writing this because our daughter will someday ask about me. When she does, please tell her this. Her father was a weak man who made terrible choices. He hurt people he should have protected. He learned too late what really matters. But most importantly, tell her that she comes from you. Your strength, your courage, your goodness. That is her legacy, not my failures. I will never contact you again after this. I hope you have found peace. Dillon. Isabel read the letter 3 times. She felt nothing at first, then a strange kind of sadness. Not for Dillon, but for the man he could have been if he had made different choices. The life they could have had if he had been someone else entirely. She folded the letter and put it in a box with other legal documents from the divorce and trial. Someday, when Hope was old enough to ask, Isabel would show it to her, not to excuse him, but to show her that even people who do terrible things are still human, flawed, broken, but human. That afternoon, Marshall called. "You are not going to believe this. Scarlett's lawyer filed another appeal." Isabel sighed. "How many is that now?" "4th one. They are claiming ineffective assistance of counsel. It will be denied like all the others. But thought you should know. Thanks for the heads up." After hanging up, Isabel felt a familiar frustration. Would it ever truly be over? Would she spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next appeal, the next parole hearing, the next chance for them to re-enter her life? She pushed the thoughts aside and focused on the present. Hope was at daycare. The nonprofit had a board meeting tonight. She had a speech to write for next month's conference. There was always work to do, and always someone who needed help. That evening at the Hope's House board meeting, they reviewed their progress. In 18 months, they had helped 53 women escape abusive situations. They had partnered with law firms to provide pro bono legal services. They had opened a second shelter house in Northern Virginia. The work was expanding faster than Isabel had dreamed. "We have also been contacted by a production company," Nora said carefully. "They want to make a documentary about your story. They would donate a significant portion of proceeds to Hope's House." Isabel felt her stomach tighten. "I do not want to be famous. I just want to do the work." "I know," Nora said gently. "But think about the reach. Your story on a platform like Netflix or Hulu, millions of women would see it. Women who do not know they are being abused. Women who think they are alone." Isabel considered this. The idea of her worst moments being packaged as entertainment made her sick. But if it helped even one woman leave an abusive situation, was not that worth the discomfort? Let me think about it, she said finally. The meeting continued with discussions of funding, programming, and expansion plans. As Isabel drove home afterward, she felt the weight of responsibility. This was no longer just her story. It belonged to every woman who had reached out, every survivor who saw themselves in her experience. She picked up Hope from Marshall's apartment, where he had been babysitting. The little girl ran to her mother, arms outstretched. Mama, Mama. Isabel scooped her up, breathing in the scent of baby shampoo and innocence. This was what mattered. Not the past, not the appeals, not even the nonprofit. As important as it was, this little girl, healthy and loved and safe. Ready to go home? Baby. Hope nodded enthusiastically, already babbling about something Uncle Marshall had shown her. As they drove through DC traffic, Isabel made her decision about the documentary. She would do it. She would tell her story one more time, as completely and honestly as possible. Not for fame or revenge, but because somewhere a woman was Googling, "Is my husband abusive?" and needed to know she was not crazy. 2 years after the courthouse incident, on a bright spring morning, Isabel stood on those same courthouse steps, but this time she was there by choice, not necessity. Today was the unveiling of a memorial plaque for survivors of domestic violence. Judge Patricia Holbrook attended the ceremony. So did Margaret Foster, the prosecutor who had secured justice. Detective Morrison was there, along with Officer Brennan, whose body camera had captured the truth. And Marshall, of course, standing beside his sister with Hope, now 2.5 years old, balanced on his hip. The plaque was simple, bronze letters on marble. In honor of all survivors, your voice matters. Your truth matters. Justice is possible. Isabel gave a short speech, her voice steady and clear. 2 years ago, on these very steps, I nearly lost it everything. My daughter, my life, my hope. But I was saved, not just by my brother's quick reflexes, but by something more fundamental. I was saved by evidence, by truth, by a system that, when it works correctly, protects the vulnerable. She acknowledged the failures too, the initial rush to reduce charges, the attempts to discredit her, the ways money and power nearly twisted justice. This memorial is not a celebration of a perfect system. It is a reminder that we must constantly fight to make justice accessible to everyone, not just those who get lucky. After the ceremony, a reporter asked, "What do you want people to know about domestic violence?" Isabel thought carefully before answering. "I want people to know it does not always look like what you think. Dylan never hit me, but he controlled our money. He isolated me from friends. He made me doubt my own perceptions. That is abuse, and it is just as dangerous as physical violence, because it breaks down your sense of self until you do not know what is real anymore." Any message for Dylan or Scarlett? No, Isabel said firmly. They do not deserve any more of my energy. My message is for survivors. You are not alone, you are not crazy, and there is a way out. That afternoon, Isabel returned to Hope's house. The documentary about her story had premiered on Netflix the previous month. It had been viewed by 18 million people in the first week. The nonprofit's donations had tripled. They were opening 2 more shelters, hiring more counselors, expanding services. But the real impact was in the messages. Thousands of them. Women sharing their stories. Women saying they finally understood they were being abused. Women who had left because of what they had seen. One email stood out. It was from Dylan's first wife, the woman who had testified at the trial. "I never told anyone the full truth about Dylan until I saw what he did to you. I carried shame for 10 years, thinking I had somehow caused his behavior. Your courage gave me permission to speak. Thank you for that." Isabel printed the email and added it to a growing folder of thank you notes. On hard days, when the work felt overwhelming, she read through them. Reminders that pain, when transformed into purpose, could create ripples of change. That evening, Isabel and Hope walked through their neighborhood park. Spring flowers bloomed everywhere. Hope toddled ahead, fascinated by every bird and squirrel. She was a happy child, unaware of the darkness that had surrounded her birth. Isabel intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. "Mama," Fly, Hope demanded. Arms raised, Isabel lifted her daughter and spun her around, both of them laughing. These moments of pure joy were what she had fought for. Not revenge, not even justice, really, but simply the right to exist peacefully with her child. Later, after Hope was asleep, Isabel sat on her small balcony with a cup of tea. Marshall called, as he did most evenings. "Saw the ceremony on the news," he said. "You look as strong." "I felt strong for the first time in a long time. I am not afraid anymore." "You should be proud of what you have built." Isabel smiled. "We built it. I could not have done any of this without you." "You could have," Marshall said gently. "You are the strongest person I know. I just helped you remember that." After they hung up, Isabel pulled out her laptop. The book was almost finished. Nearly 300 pages of her story, told with brutal honesty. Her editor said it would be published in 6 months. Already, it was generating interest from book clubs and survivor groups. She opened to the final chapter and began typing. This is not a story about revenge. Scarlett will spend at least 15 more years in prison, probably more. Dylan has 13 years left on his sentence. Their punishment is not my victory. My victory is sitting in my daughter's room right now, sleeping peacefully in her crib. My victory is the nonprofit we have built, the lives we have saved. My victory is waking up every morning without fear. That is what justice looks like. Not punishment for the guilty, though that matters, but freedom for the survivor, the freedom to rebuild, to heal, to help others, to live. She wrote for another hour, finding the words to close her story. When she finished, she sat back and reread the final paragraphs. If you are reading this and you are in an abusive relationship, please know this. It is not your fault. You did not cause it. You cannot fix it. But you can leave. It will be hard. The hardest thing you have ever done. But on the other side of that door is your life. Your real life, the one you deserve. Take my hand. Take the hand of every woman who has walked this path before you. We will help you through. You are not alone. You have never been alone. We have been waiting for you. Come home." Isabel saved the document and closed her laptop. She walked to Hope's room one more time, watching her daughter sleep. The little girl had Dylan's nose, but Isabel's stubborn chin. She would grow up knowing she was loved, knowing she was wanted, knowing she came from strength. "We made it, baby," Isabel whispered. "We really made it." Outside, the city lights glittered against the night sky. Somewhere in federal prisons, Dylan and Scarlett served their sentences. But here, in this small apartment, life continued, not perfect, never perfect, but peaceful, real, free. Isabel returned to the balcony and looked up at the stars. 2 years ago, she had been a woman fighting for survival. Now she was a woman who had served and chosen to help others do the same. The journey from victim to survivor to advocate had been long and painful. But standing here now, with her daughter safe and her purpose clear, Isabel understood something fundamental. Justice is not just about courtrooms and verdicts. It is about reclaiming your life, about transforming pain into purpose, about refusing to let the worst moments define you. Her phone buzzed with a text from Nora. "Tomorrow's intake meeting has 5 new women. We are making a difference." Isabel smiled and texted back, "We will help them all." She sat on the balcony a while longer, drinking her tea, planning tomorrow's work. The documentary had brought new attention, new funding, new opportunities to expand. They could help more women save more lives, create more stories of survival. The wound of what Dylan and Scarlett had done would never fully heal. Some scars run too deep. But Isabel had learned to carry those scars without letting them define her. She was more than what had happened to her. She was what she had become because of it. A mother, an advocate, a survivor, a warrior. The night air grew cool. Isabel went inside, locked the door behind her, and set the alarm. Security was still important. Trust was still earned carefully. But fear no longer controlled her life. She checked on Hope one final time, kissing her daughter's forehead gently. Then she climbed into her own bed, exhausted but content. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new women who needed help, new battles to fight. But tonight she could rest. Isabel Crawford closed her eyes and, for the first time in years, slept peacefully through the entire night. No nightmares, no anxiety, just the deep, restorative sleep of someone who had fought for justice and won, not because her abusers were punished, though they were, but because she had reclaimed her own life, her own voice, her own power. And that ultimately was the only victory that mattered.